Yeah, so I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and I offer my gratitude to the First Nations for their care and teachings about our earth and relations. May we honor those teachings. And I will begin by sharing my screen. This is a little bit of a travelogue. It's a little bit of my experiences, and it's a little bit of everything really that took me to Crete in my residency, and how what my expectation was or my plan was changed very differently from what I had written down and had submitted to the residency. So what is an art residency? And perhaps you've been on one or created one. And generally it's a time away from routine, a different place. You generally go somewhere. It's a time for reflection, for research, or to work on something. And I like to always mention that to me, it's the 3 E's. It's exploring, experimenting, and experiencing. And those, while they sound similar, can be quite different kinds of thought processes and actions as you go along. Now, I started in England and to visit family, and I'll mention also that my husband came along on this trip, which turned out to be a really good thing in so many ways. And I mention David Hockney, who we were staying in Yorkshire, and he was born and brought up and lived for many, many years in Yorkshire. But the exhibition that I went to was a year in Normandy, where he had lived in Normandy for a year, and almost not really an art residency, but a different place, a place apart. And he focused on creating pieces of work on his iPad and looking at the seasons changing in his small community in Normandy. So I went into this large room, as you can see how long it is, and on the walls were these 4 by 6 foot drawings, and each one was a mural that he had done in his residency. So it went through, you walked around in this long, long oval and experienced his insight into where he was living and the changing seasons through the year in Normandy. We also stopped in Paris, and I don't want to dwell too much, and many of you have been there, but it was our first time, and we did generally the usual touristy things. And I think with Paris, you could live there for years and still not see everything that that city has to offer. But one thing I did do was we were walking along and I saw the Sennelier store. And Sennelier is a very well-known brand of art products, paints, and different related art supplies. So I had to go in. And of course, I had to buy, of course. And so I bought a little package of things to take home. Now, just to give a little bit of context to where I was and sort of the geography of Greece, this was our first time to visit Greece. It was a fabulous experience. I really enjoyed everything that came about, and I would love to go back. So the red arrow is Athens. capital city of Greece, and where we landed. But we went immediately to a small seaside community called Heraklion, which was a lovely place to visit. It had been in former times the capital, one of the capitals of Greece. And so there was a huge amount of history involved, of both ancient and fairly modern history. And then down at the bottom, you can see the island of Crete, and Heraklion is where we went. And we did drive around Crete a fair bit, but we also were able to base ourselves during the residency in the city of Heraklion. So that gives you a little bit of context, and you can see, you know, I only touched very, very little on the surface of what is possible to see and do in Greece. This, and of course, everything about Greece, you know, is both ancient and modern. This was a fortress up on a hillside, and it was just such a perfect opportunity to take an image with my camera with the moon and the fortress all lit up. And being an artist, and I'm sure you often find these wonderful photo opportunities. We as artists tend to take pictures of, you know, doors and weathered things, and just, you know, not the usual tourist viewpoints. But the one on the left to me was it was the window in a museum, and it just kind of focused a perfect composition with line and texture and interesting shapes, and also interesting, you know, complementary colors in there. And so I always like to, you know, talk about interesting, different images. We love to eat, of course, and being October when we were there, the temperature was absolutely perfect. So we did, you know, a lot of strolling around the town in the evenings and that. I included the bottle of wine because I had never sampled Greek wine, and it is delicious. I really loved every little sip, and I took that picture because it reminded me of my son, who has a lovely, great big beard. We took every opportunity, of course, to go to museums, and while my husband was really interested in the historical part, I always gravitated to the textiles and more the ethnography, the cultural aspect of the museums, and love to look at the different ways of working in the traditional crafts, you know, knitting and embroidery and so on, but also seeing a lot of cross transfer between what we're doing currently and what has happened in the past with both folkloric costumes and the day-to-day garments, you know, that rich embroidery that we would see on costumes that would be worn for celebrations and things like weddings and so on. That was, to me, that was just so visually amazing that just I got so excited about. So part of it was, you know, eating. So I encountered some very, very delicious food there that I am learning to recreate since I've gotten home. And one of my little surprises as we were on the bus, we passed over the Corinth Canal, which actually separates mainland Greece to the Peloponnese area. It was 2,500 years in the making. It's only been open for the last century and a half, but if you get a chance, just look it up online, because there's some fascinating information about it that I really enjoyed finding out a bit about. It's still being used, but of course, that's 200 feet down into the canal, but it's limited now in the size of boats that it can allow. We visited Athens, and probably many of you have been to those wonderful sites of ancient Athens and ancient Greece. What always strikes me about these places is how close the city is. The day-to-day workings of the city surrounds the Acropolis and is almost integrated into the buildings that people are living and working and visiting in. I met the most amazing person who introduced me to so much of what is wonderful about Greece and Athens. Alexandra and I met up for several days. She was one of my students, has been one of my students online for quite some time, and it was just such a treasure to meet with her and learn more about her and her art practice. And also, she was so welcoming about introducing us to those little hidden away spots that the locals know best in their community. Plus, we also went shopping for fabric. So here are two amazing dishes. Get your pen and paper if you want, and make note of bugatsa and baklava. So you may be familiar with baklava, but this is sort of a deconstructed version with a pistachio puree, ice cream in the middle with the phyllo and this wonderful sweet honey topping on it. Just amazing food. And of course, we often like to take pictures of our food, but bugatsa is a little different. I'd never encountered it before. And it's phyllo pastry again with a lovely creamy filling. It's fried and then sprinkled with icing sugar and cinnamon, but it's also sort of you have it with coffee in the morning or late morning type thing. So when I first applied for the art residency in Lakkos, which was the suburb of Heraklion, I had thought I would work on narrative and text. So I was looking at things in the museums that I saw that used ancient script. In this case, it's linear A and B, which was one of the first marks on, in this case, clay, that research has shown. And I love the scratchings and the imagery that it creates. And so I thought that that would be something I would investigate and work with and study. What drew me into some of the museums that we visited was these vessels and vases that we found. We think of clay, pottery as one element, but the glassware I thought was just so beautiful. That pearlescence or opalescence, the tinges of color, the translucency, but not the transparency. I was just really entranced by the way these pieces gleamed with the light. And I also looked at some of the markings on the vessels, the script, the patterns, and the elements that go up to make the design on these pieces. We did tour around Crete a little bit, but this is the rooms in the residency. The neighborhood was interesting because it was a very old neighborhood on the outskirts of the business portion of the city, and the building itself had probably been around for well over 100 years. It was a lot of stone and brick covered with plaster. It had been at one time a candy shop. So in the top right photo, you can see the windows there with sort of a bar across. And that was where they opened the doors into the candy shop. It's now the kitchen, but it was kind of fun to visualize candy being made in these um, earthen vats where I guess they would have boiled the sugar or the honey. The house was decorated with the owner's artwork as well as some of the residents' artwork. Matthew is the owner of the residence. He's Australian. And there was a very eclectic mix of furnishings around and always something interesting and kind of quirky about it. This was my favorite place in the residence. It was an interior courtyard. So as you can imagine, a lot of the homes are right on the sidewalk or the small roadway. So you went in and into part of the house and then through into this interior courtyard. And you can see the steps leading off. And these are sort of two different directions to the left and the right. And so those interior stairs led up to a roof terrace that was lovely to sit and enjoy the view. And it was beautiful plants. Of course, it was still very mild. In the summertime, it can get into the high 40s Celsius, so very, very hot. It is only about less than 200 kilometers from North Africa, so it is further down into the Mediterranean. This is a view from the rooftop terrace, and the neighborhood was what you might call in transition. There was very old buildings, there were abandoned buildings, empty buildings, there was disintegrating buildings, but there was also construction going on. So there were some newer apartment blocks, there were some private residences, there were small private hotels. So a real eclectic mix. And just about around every corner, there was a tavern or a bar, which would be open through the day and into the evening. So not just a bar, but there were food, there was coffee, there were drinks of all kinds, and always a place for the locals to gather and chat and meet up. Now, one of the things that I noticed about Greece, more so than most countries, is the amount of graffiti. And part of it is, I think, related to the political situation, the unemployment rate. Greece suffered far worse than many countries in the crash of 2008. And so there was a lot of graffiti on it, some better than others. And the local community, Matthew, who ran the residency, started adding murals to the neighborhood with the permission of the local council, and some of the neighbors. And so they would be made both by Matthew and other residents who came over time. There was always a supply of paint that you could really basically paint up whatever you chose, in good taste, but they could be artistic, or they could be graphic or abstract. And one of the reasons this was a popular thing in this community was that then it stopped some of the graffiti from appearing, because generally, if something is painted on, then other graffiti people won't paint on top of it. So the idea was that it would beautify the neighborhood and create a more positive environment for everybody. And some of the work was just stunning. And because I couldn't really read the street signs, it became a way of finding my way through the neighborhood. I knew I could turn when I reached a certain point and go down a different road. So you can see some of the graffiti, or the murals rather, sorry, the murals were really lovely and beautifully done. This is our group in the residence that we were out for a drink and a meal, and there were 2 people from Australia, my husband and I there at the back. Marika was from Germany, and Jesse was from Britain. So a mixture of interests. This wasn't just focused on textile by any means. There were watercolor people. There was somebody who came towards the end who was a charcoal artist. So a real different community of interests and focus. So this is my work spot. So you can see I'm set up at a table there, looking out into that courtyard that I showed you earlier. The walls, one of the downsides was the walls were always flaking off plaster and dust. So sometimes I would leave something to dry or bump against it, and all of a sudden there would be a little sprinkle of dust incorporated into my paint. But that was part of the fun of it. And it was fun to sit there and just kind of watch the coming and going of people and the dogs and cats who live there. And that, as you can see, is the stairway going upstairs. So I started out doing some painting on fabric. I was trying some different mediums, different ways of working, and then pinned it up to dry. I started out looking around my neighborhood and trying different focus. I did some sketching, some light painting. I like to keep a sketchbook / journal of what I'm doing, and so making notes, trying some different things. And again, I made something on a napkin. I didn't bring very much purposely in the way of supplies, because we had to haul everything across Europe. So everything that I was brought fit into sort of a smallish container. And I knew I had to take it home again, so I didn't want to purchase too much on the way. But I was really kind of, the first 2 or 3 days, I just didn't know where I was going with anything. But I did like the idea just of the vessels, the pottery that was scattered around the residence and that we had seen in the museums. So I did some painting on that. And then I started looking at the shape of these things and thinking, okay, what is it that appeals to me? I made some stencils, so I was stenciling the shadows or the outline of the vessels, trying different shapes of vessels, and trying different combinations and layering each one on top of each other. Then I was doing more, and I brought a variety of different papers. I had some nautical charts. So I was just experimenting. And each time I did that, things started to gel together a little bit or lead me into working and focusing on this. I was working with paper and fabric, some art canvas, some vintage napkins that I had dyed, and so on. And then I had brought a small gel plate, so I was making gel prints with the stencils, and I was looking then at the patterning on these vessels and thinking, okay, this is something that is speaking to me. I then moved into randomly painting the surface of the paper, adding inks and acrylics and making them move across the paper. The paper was wet and sort of wicked into areas. And then I started cutting out from the back, from the reverse side of the paper, and seeing the patterning appear when it's isolated into a shape. And that started to get me really excited. And all this time I'm working small with sort of 8x10 size, not very large, but I'm thinking, okay, these are things that I could transfer on top of each other, trying different compositions, taking photographs, moving them around, taking more photographs, and then looking at collage background, painted backgrounds. So I was sort of imitating stonework in behind these vessels. I bought a Greek newspaper, so I was painting that to get some text on that, again, going back into the patterning. And then my husband went off to one of the museums and came back with this photograph. And all of a sudden, it was like, oh yeah, this is something that I see as a focus of the vessel as the feminine. And that's sort of my subtitle of what I'm thinking about and working towards now. So then I started making notes. What is a vessel? What could a vessel be? So it's a storage. It's storing for the future. It's a womb. It could be something fertile, something within holding that future, and it can be a receptacle, a shell that's protecting something within. And one of the things I saw immediately is that I wanted to work much larger. So that was, it was great to work in the smaller context and create small, because as I mentioned, I had to think about taking it home afterwards. So then I started making lists of the vessels and an exploration of the feminine. So I'm thinking dimensional vessels. So in the residency, I was working small and I was working flat, basically two-dimension surface. I could work onto a substrate, so I could build a wire frame and add something on top of that. I could print images or meaning onto the surface. I could screen print, I could write it on, I could paint it on. I could create different groupings of vessels so I could unify a message. I could create vessels that show different ages of the female. So the girl into motherhood, into the crone. I could change the material in the vessels. I could work with paper clay or paper mache. creating shape and more structure in that. I could incorporate stitch or pattern and so on into the vessel. So those are all kinds of ways of working. So I think with a residency, it becomes the start of an exploration. I did a month-long residency in Iceland several years ago, and that was about exploring many, many, many different topics, different ways. The overarching theme was creating books with cloth and text and narrative. And so I ended up doing many prototypes, whereas in Crete, I focused more into basically one very focused subject matter, which allowed me to start to go deeper and much deeper into the subject. So that excites me. And it's not to say that one is better than the other, it's just different ways of working. So I came home and immediately thought, okay, I want to see that idea of creating a surface with paint or line or shape and color in a larger context. So you can see this is a larger piece of linen that I had diluted some gesso and translucent gesso or clear gesso, and it gives a bit more tooth to the fabric. It stiffens it a bit, but it allows the paint to travel, but also I can wet it and it kind of wicks into areas. So I used some acrylic ink. I used Dynaflow. Many of you are familiar with that. It's an acrylic paint, but it's very fluid and it's easy to work with. It's highly concentrated pigment, so even though you dilute it a lot, it still is really good color. And then I outlined some areas in marker. I just used a Sharpie, and then put some fusible on the back and cut out some larger shapes on there. So once I'd cut them out, I had some dyed linen, and I was looking at putting them onto, they had to sit somewhere. So I was just auditioning some different fabrics, thinking about maybe brickwork at the back, and just a very early way of working on seeing what I might do with this. And you can see on the vessels themselves, I'd added some white with my new Posca markers, which are great to work with on fabric. And then right now, this piece I did a few days ago. So again, it's working into the fabric, trying to outline different areas and give a patina or a look of a vessel kind of shape. And then I'll go back and do something similar. I'm still developing shapes that I want to work with, looking back into some resources to see what kinds of shapes I have as photographs, or visit some website museums, or look at different vessel shapes from Greece that I could use as a jumping off point. So, so I've got that as a starting point, but you can see from what I've mentioned so far there's just so many different possibilities. And I think that's what becomes so key to moving away from our normal art practice and trying something new, trying an experiment that or exploration that might not have been the original idea, but being able to grab that concept and go more deeply into it. Most times when you apply for a residency, you are giving a summary of what your intent is. And they don't want reams of paper, but they'd like a one-page letter of intention. And a lot of places, or most places other than the more academic focused places, want you to use it as a starting point, which I've done and which some of the other people in the residence have done. And it's always kind of an exciting way of going into something with a very open mind, with an open idea, and seeing where that will take you. Now, what I'd like, oh, and this is what I ended up doing. So I came back on the 2nd of November, and then all of a sudden jumped into an online or a solo exhibition at our local gallery. So this is a body of work titled The Industrial Shoreline that I've been working on for a few, 2 or 3 years now. And this was sort of the first time I brought it all the work together. And when you can put your work up into a place that is outside your studio, that is well lit, and the pieces are well hung, it just looks so different and so much better. So this one finished off a week or so ago, and then I was able to get back into what I started in Crete. And the industrial shoreline was focused on our marine ecosystem and the problems that international shipping and our desire for consumer goods kind of clash and have challenges. So that was hung up. And so now I would like to invite you to think about what you might like to focus on in a residency. Perhaps you've been thinking about something and you're looking to find a focus or explore something that's been calling to you. And so for the month of January, I am offering an artist deep dive online residency. And my role in this is to offer different parts of what a residency might be for you, to ask you some questions, and then to step back and be more of a mentor. And so I just want to explain what that looks like, and then we'll move into the Q&A time. And I hope you have lots of questions. So this starts with building an artist statement, that intention, helping you refine your vision, building a structure into your month. So we're just focusing on 1 month. I like to journal. I like to journal and sketch together and be asking myself why, the big why, little whys all along, how you might use a call and response in your practice. So sometimes we like to go after the big shiny things and get sidetracked, which isn't It's different from a call and response where you are working on something and there's something that appears and you need to explore that. So that's a little bit different. We're how we might work through that messy middle when we hate everything and it's not working, and how to move past that. So we're going to have a community. We're going to have weekly Zoom meetings with focused topic and guests. We're going to also have a casual coffee time Zoom meeting, and we're going to have a private Facebook group to share, to encourage one another and that. So each week begins on a Sunday, and another web page will open, but they're not really lessons because I don't consider this a teaching time. It's more of a working together time. Just to let you know that the Zoom sessions will be 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, so that might fit into your schedule. You'll always have lifetime access, and I think one of the important parts is that I'll be providing you with lots of PDFs to work on, to ask you questions, to give you some thoughts and some ideas on how you might work. So this is $145 Canadian, and you can register just by, if you go to susanpm.com, that's pretty straightforward, and look for online workshops. Okay, so now these, if you can take a screenshot, by all means take one of this. These are some of the resources that if you're interested in going somewhere for an art residency, there's websites that are dedicated to art residencies as their primary focus, or maybe even your secondary focus. As I mentioned, you can get this list from this meeting that I'll post up on YouTube. So these are all, they list residencies. You can do searches through them. They're search engines, so you can put in country, you can put in topic, you can put in open calls, and so on. So these are really good resources. Most of them will ask for some intention. They'll ask for a CV or a bio, and maybe images or links to your website and so on. And they're meant for the practicing artists such as yourselves. You don't have to be a very recognized artist, because these are ways of building your interest and your skills there on that.